Hey Theo,
Hey Pranab,
how's it going?
pretty good. How's it going for you?
Pretty good. So today we'll be recording some riffs on parts work, which is a topic we both are quite into and talk about a lot. So I think the impetus for this podcast was the fact that so we work together quite a bit on parts work stuff, and we tweet about it and think about it, and we thought, hey, let's record and see what happens.
Yeah. And the conversations are naturally interesting. So, yeah, definitely feels worthwhile to give recording a go and see what comes out of it.
Nice. Yeah, fully agreed. So to start, how about we both introduce ourselves in relation to our parts work journeys? Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go first. And so I discovered parts work in early 21 when I was really desperate to resolve my emotional hangups. And Um, I s- I think my first introduction to parts work, apart from some tweets and here and there, was the Richard Schwartz interview with Tim Ferriss, which which is still my go-to recommendation to anyone who is curious about IFS or parts work in general. Because they also do a live demo on the podcast, which is very emotionally moving, and the prompts that uh, Dick Schwartz gives Tim Ferriss will also give you some glimpses of your own parts. And I got some glimpses of my own parts through that episode. I picked up the book Self Therapy by Jay Early after that and started doing some spontaneous parts work on my own. And then, along the same time, like one of the other psychotechnologies that I also pinned a lot of hopes on in that period to resolve my emotional hangups was MDMA. And it turns out MDMA and parts work are super synergistic with each other. And so, yeah, for me, over the next year and two, parts work and MDMA helped me resolve a lot of my emotional hangups, helped me connect with myself much more deeply, and then consequently with people around me. And so yeah, for me, that's how it started. And then uh, I found myself guiding sessions for other people. Initially, it was just friends. And then I sent out a tweet randomly one day on this alt account of mine saying, hey, if anyone would like to try IFS with me, feel free to reach out. A few people reached out. You were among them. And these people had interesting experiences and tweeted about their experiences. And I also got a lot of encouragement from people in the community, specifically you, to lean into this, even charge for it and like offer it as a service. And it felt good to lean in and felt aligned to lean in. And so I started guiding these IFS sessions. So initially it was just IFS before it became more general. And but yeah, long story short, I ended up doing I think almost 500 sessions in this period, close to 1,000 hours. And yeah, it's been like such a rewarding journey for me, and have met people from all walks of life, all parts of world, guided sessions for them, and learned so much along the way, and continuing to learn so much. And yeah, it's been also very fun to continue working with you in this period and
Mhm.
uh, see how your journey has evolved as well, and have my evolution as a coach being witnessed by you and encouraged, supported, and yeah, also like receiving a lot of valuable inputs along the way. So yeah, this is my story. Over to you.
Nice. That's awesome, man. I felt very warm hearing a lot of that, which is great. Yeah, I think for me, a lot of similar stuff. While you were talking, I actually realized that it went back a bit farther. So, yeah, I think for me, it started off with meditation. And without going too much into my meditation story, the basic parts are that in my last semester of school, I took this class on mindful self compassion. And before that, I was into meditation for a few years through the Headspace app and things like that. And then I got turned on to this kind of compassion focused meditation and just compassion practice in general. And I thought, wow, this is great. And then proceeded to not think about it for a while. So this was like spring of 2019. And then I moved to San Francisco and got deeper into meditation and learned about spacious awareness practice and things like that. And that's all good. And we'll put a bookmark there. But that I think started the foundation for kind of noticing some of the somatic sensations in my body, and just for the first time, really, and in general, having higher resolution sensory clarity, a larger sense of spaciousness, and kind of a lot of these um, prerequisites or components to um, the kind of parts where the somatic parts were general class of methods. So that was all that. And then I would say I went home for the holidays in the winter, and I remember there being kind of an incident where for years I think I've always been like a pretty chill person, mostly conflict averse, but then I had realized during that time in December that I had often kind of suppressed my anger or kind of not really wanted to feel it, and it led to kind of this argument with my brother that was like not great, and it led to me kind of just like arguing in a way where I wasn't even aware of what was happening, and I was just like yelling, and I just felt bad afterwards too. um and then after that I was like, okay, I think I should probably go to therapy because even though 99% of the time uh I have like good behavior, or I'm just like doing stuff the way I think is skillful, having these burst outs like once in a while doesn't seem great or healthy. And I kind of learned by going down that journey how much was like more suppressed and kind of tight versus kind of released and expressed. So then I started working with a therapist, I think in February or March of 2020, which was around pandemic time. And this person was I found him because he also was aware of the use of psychedelics for therapy, which was also a topic that I was getting into around then. And he had experience with a lot of these trauma work modalities, like focusing and IFS. And that's when I first learned about those terms, but I didn't really know what it was or how it worked. And working with him, we didn't really get into that level of detail, but it was good. It was a bit kind of, it incorporated some of the meditation stuff I liked. He was aware of some of these topics, and every week during these sessions, we would kind of get in, and it would be good. It would be a little slow, but slow and steady. But I'd kind of have feelings of, like, oh, there's a part of me that feels like this, a part of me that feels like that, without actually knowing kind of the framework from which he was coming from. I was just doing it. And I'm a very, I think, framework, intellectual kind of indexing and understanding kind of person. So in summer of 2020, I dove a lot deeper into it and started realizing, wait, there's this thing called internal family systems, IFS. There's this thing called focusing. There's somatic experiencing. And over time, I've learned there's also coherence therapy and all these other things. Um, and I started to try to figure out how they all work together, and like, what is this thing of parts work? And I think both the Richard Schwartz, Tim Ferriss interview and the book Self Therapy by Jay Earley were both really pivotal for my journey. Um, and since then, I've kind of I've never coached anyone or been trained in that, but I've kind of done some informal stuff with friends, but really kind of just like deepening it in myself, just kind of more aspects of my life, learning how to do it more often throughout the day. Most recently, I've been applying it to different parts of my life, in work and relationships, in decision making. It's been really helpful, and in general, it's just kind of this view and way of looking that's been incredibly powerful for my day to day, for my meditation practice, and just for like well being and life in general. Um, so yeah, I think the general class of somatic parts work modalities is key, really important, and I think just like a huge upgrade, for people in terms of not just therapy and for healing, but for flourishing and kind of getting the most out of life. So I'm, quite passionate about this whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, that is lovely to hear. And I think you did a great job selling the idea, or like getting someone invested in why this can be so valuable.
Yeah.
Because yeah, in my experience, it's not just one thing that it helps you with. So of course, like it helps you feel through your emotions and like move towards
Mhm.
wholeness. But there's so much more to it. I also feel it has enriched my relationships, because like by learning to relate with your parts from a place of love and curiosity and compassion, you automatically also learn to relate to people around you from that place. And yeah, before we go any further, I think a good place to
Mhm.
start would be how do each of us see parts work? How do we define it, or like what
Yep.
does it mean to us? And I think a related question that someone posted was, what's the 80/20 of parts work according to you? So yeah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was gonna go there too. It's interesting because yeah, I've often made this mistake of not describing it because it's a little complicated, but it's also very simple. And I think a lot of the work we've both done in the last couple of years is learning how to view it in a very simple way. So I'll kind of break it down. Um, there are all these different modalities, and they all have their own steps and like books and these trainings around all of them. But I think the thing that puts them all in common is a few steps. One, it's this ability to have what's called kind of meta awareness, or I think metacognition, about what you're feeling in the moment. Um, so having this awareness of like what's going on. You might, so in this moment, there's a part of me that's a little, and we say this very, very in colloquial terms too. Like a part of
Yeah.
me is like this, a part of me is like that. So there's that general gist. Next is kind of going a bit deeper there, and um, knowing that you can then kind of like isolate and map that part of you to a feeling in the body. There's a somatic sensation, and the somatic sensation um, could be, you can, in focusing, it's called a handle. So you can find a handle there, and then use words to describe what it's feeling into what is like a felt sense. So this, okay, there's a part of me that feels like this. Okay, that is kind of in my lower back. And for some people, there's, instead of going to the body, they go into like an image or a character. And that's fine too. I find for me it's a bit more somatic, but that's also fine. Then from there, so that's the whole kind of finding and locating parts. The next aspect is this view of having a compassionate, kind view towards those parts, not seeing them as bad. Richard Schwartz, the creator of IFS, has this book called No Bad Parts, and there's really kind of a general stance towards all these that you can cultivate, and I think this is where compassion practice and um, even altered states like MDMA that you can get from MDMA and deep jhana can really help, where you just have this stance of kindness towards all these things. So that's quite helpful. And then the third is um, kind of merging them together, and you're able to dialogue or kind of just interact with these parts in a way that leads to wholeness, a greater sense of spaciousness, completion, and stillness. And that, I think, across a bunch of different modalities, is kind of the general arc. And in any given session, it might not be, you might not go all the way, and there's not necessarily um, all that, but there's kind of like aspects of it. And I think there's different, within those three, there are a lot of different specific techniques and specific practices. But that's kind of how I view it. It's the parts model of the mind, which you don't even have to take super seriously. You don't have to, it doesn't have to map to the brain. It doesn't have to be quote unquote how things are, but it's just a very useful way to see and kind of um, interact with your psyche. This general aspect of like safety, kindness, love, wholeness that is accessible at any time that you can kind of tap into, even just a little tiny bit to support you in this process. And then third is being able to kind of map and interface and dialogue between it. So kind of shifts into something. Um, and those shifts are very much, I think, what makes it work. Because like you can kind of tell someone like, oh yeah, your mind is made of parts and multiple, and it's all very cognitive. But once you kind of do the exercises, and once it starts to work a little bit, you notice how when doing the dialogue, stuff just feels different, and it almost becomes an inner compass towards your own healing and towards change, where you just see that stuff is happening. It doesn't have to necessarily even make sense, but it kind of works. And I think that is what has been super cool for me.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And yeah, resonates a lot. And yeah, especially like all the things that you described, like there was this feeling of how it just animates your inner world, and which is otherwise like if before this, like if I were to look at my own inner experience before discovering parts work, even when I was introspecting, it was much more inanimate in some sense. Like there was like maybe analysis going on, or there was maybe sometimes just noise. I am not feeling good and I don't know what that feeling is. And so it was either like gray or noisy or analysis. And yeah, after discovering parts work, like your inner world becomes so much more animated. And yeah, one way to look at parts work is it is a way of seeing that animates your unconscious. And yeah, to add more to that way of seeing frame, I think the cool thing about parts work, and what also gives it a lot of power in my opinion, is the relational nature of it. So much of our experience, so much of our suffering, so much of our conflicts are relational in nature fundamentally. And so it's only natural that a lot of what goes on in our mind will also have a relational flavor to it. And what parts work does, it takes that relationality and brings that frame into self exploration. And now suddenly everything that is going on in your mind can be seen as this drama playing out. And for me personally, it's a very vivid visual experience with a lot of characters. For me, actually, like it's very similar to dreams in the sense that
Hmm.
a lot of the movies and TV shows or any media that I have consumed recently makes its way into my parts work explorations. I see random characters appearing as my IFS parts. For some people, it's very mythical, or for some people, it's like there's a lot of animals, and so it also like shows how rich your inner life is. And it's just so heartwarming to have that experience that, oh, like there's just so much richness within me. Like leave aside all the benefits, just witnessing the richness of your inner world is um, yeah, it's amazing. And then so yeah, I think a lot of value comes from this relational frame and gives you an opportunity to interact with uh, parts of your mind in a very relational way. And then to another way to how I would describe parts work to someone, I sent out a tweet recently which went something like, so we all carry certain painful feelings that we have accumulated over the course of our life, and that are unmetabolized or unprocessed. And uh, in some sense, our life or our mind is organized around avoiding these painful feelings. And so on one hand, there's these painful feelings that are unprocessed or suppressed, or however you want to label them. And then there's layers of copes or defenses or protectors that uh, that we have built to ensure that we don't have to feel these painful feelings. And one of the things that we are doing with parts work is lovingly persuading these protectors, these defenses, to let go, to tell them that, hey, this thing that you don't want me to feel, it's it's actually okay and safe to feel that now. And if we allow ourselves to feel that, not only will we be safe and okay, but we will also get empowered in the process and be free from this burden that we have carried all our life. And so that's the simple 80/20 for me, that parts work is one way of simply feeling the feels we don't want to feel, and
Mhm.
then in the process become more free, empowered, whole, and yeah, bunch of other good things.
For sure. That's awesome. Yeah, I find that a way that I've been viewing this entire project is kind of towards greater internal trust, like building self trust. Like, how do you build self trust? I find that doing parts work can be the how or the process of doing that. It can also be towards like an internal landscape of like cohesion and peace, and
Hmm.
just like generally reducing inner conflict and thrashing. And it's interesting because this is not necessarily, there's a lot of ways you can generally do that. There's the, looking at the therapeutic landscape from where this was kind of originally thought of, there was talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and CBT. There's this kind of this arc that you're not an expert in, but this arc of kind of progression within the field of therapy towards now trauma, um, which is where a lot of this has its roots. But even outside of trauma, this is just like a helpful way of thinking through things. And I find that my I guess rational brain, or kind of the part of me that likes to make things like mechanistic and very step by step operational, really enjoys this, because it's a way to kind of really see, you can do each move and just notice what happens with it, and it's a way that you can just feel things change versus this kind of general abstract fuzzy way of seeing therapy and how stuff happens, which is I think how I typically have seen it online.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think the moves bit is really interesting, because like both of us started with IFS and both of us inherited a lot of moves from that modality. But over time, both of us discovered that there's just so many moves that you could make in this general parts work framework. And yeah, I'm curious to hear about your journey discovering moves, and what have been some of your go-to moves, and anything else that you'd like to add to that.
For sure. Yeah, I think before going more into that, I think I want to emphasize, so the 80/20 of all this is really kind of like, once if you see that this kind of works for you, there's a bit more conceptual stuff to learn. And I think taking on this conceptual framework then just gives a foundation for how to learn so much more. And that's where these moves fit in. And then I think from there you can kind of stack all these things in a way that builds together. Um, Versus I think before learning about parts work and kind of this the somatic parts work way of doing things, all this stuff in psychology and all these tips and tactics and exercises felt just like disparate and disconnected, and kind of like, oh, this thing over here and this thing over here and this thing over here. But I think now it all just feels cohesive. And I honestly have like a way of seeing a lot of, like like more intense mental illness stuff like depression, anxiety, leaky anger, even like larger difficult things like narcissistic personality disorder, trauma, or even other psychological frameworks like the Enneagram. Like they kind of can all be explained through this kind of constellations of parts way of looking. And doesn't necessarily mean it's true or the only way of looking. And there's obviously lots of other systems that work, but it's a way that's very cohesive. And by taking it on, it just, things can make a bit more sense. And then both have more explanatory descriptive sense, and then like predictive operational power, then you can actually do something about it from the parts work lens in a way that's really helpful. um and some of so yeah, well, I'll give you a couple minutes for that in case you
Yeah,
want to say anything.
yeah, no, yeah. To that, I think the cool thing about the explanatory power of parts work in general is that you can experientially verify it on your own.
Yeah.
And let's take an example where uh, maybe you struggle with anxiety, and then there comes this framework that suggests you to see that anxiety as a part of you that is trying to help you or protect you. And And yeah, it makes sense on paper or it sounds promising. But from there, I think it's very easy and quick to have an experience that validates that. And this relates back to what you were saying earlier, that you can feel the change happening in real time, where when you connect with this part that makes you anxious, and if you're able to connect with this part from a place of openness and compassion and understand why the part does what it does, feel genuine appreciation for this part, which in itself is a big thing, right? Because uh, there's this thing that we struggle with, and then there's the fight that we have with the thing itself. So in this example, if it's anxiety that you struggle with, you also struggle with like fighting that anxiety, and that fight itself prevents resolution. And so when this frame comes in and helps you connect with that part that makes you anxious, and suddenly that fight drops away, even for some moments, and there's instantly more spaciousness, instantly more okay with that anxiety existing. And then, yeah, and then hopefully you also then get to connect with the part that the anxious part is protecting, and feel through that hurt, integrate it, and unburden it, and all those things. And you can see that change happening in real time. And so that explanatory power like gets validated in real time. And that's why I think people also get instantly hooked on to IFS. For people who have that one good experience with parts work, it's easy to get hooked on because you see the effects very much in real time and you feel the change within you in a very palpable way. So, uh, and from there, it's compared to other therapeutic modalities where you need to maintain some form of motivation or faith that this will
Mhm.
eventually work for me, or this is quote unquote evidence backed. And so I need to stick to it. Compared to that, like with something like parts work, you can have almost instantaneous results, which you can feel. And so you don't have to like make yourself motivated to do more of it. It just feels good to do.
Mhm.
And yeah, also adding one more point to this about what makes parts work cool is the whole non-pathological, non-antagonizing frame, where it drops the frame of there's something wrong with you. And that's another burden that we all carry, right? Which is what creates the fight within us. You can drop that uh, frame and then bring a sense of curiosity about what's going on in your mind and in your inner life. And yeah, just that approach is just brings so much lightness, even if the
Yeah.
problems very much stay the same.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of building on that, with anxiety, I often have, anxiety often comes from, it's not just this thing that just comes out of nowhere. Often there's kind of a history or pattern for it. And the fact that, maybe an initial event triggered that anxiety. I have a friend who recently developed kind of fear and some anxiousness around flying after a flight with a lot of heavy turbulence. And then after that, every time they would get on an airplane, it would just be like lots of anxiety to the point where they wouldn't want to go on a flight by themselves. And I think there's a lot of different ways in the therapeutic way to work with that. But using that as an example, in a given, um, like I think exposure therapy and all these kind of things, um, maybe even CBT, you can recognize cognitively that it doesn't make sense, or there's whatever there's kind of like maybe there's black and white thinking there. There's all this kind of stuff, right? But it's all very cognitive. Within the IFS way, or maybe not necessarily just IFS, but within this kind of somatic parts based way, you can in a given session bring it back up, and then just to enough where it's not overwhelming for the body. So you actually are taking on some of that feeling in the moment, but then you're actually also having a sense of spaciousness, reserve, and reservoir of well-being, either through that a facilitator can kind of support you with and kind of help you rouse from within yourself and just from outside to then kind of work with that. And then eventually you kind of notice this contradictory experience, and then there's a bit of healing and spaciousness that opens up, and then you might be able to do that maybe at that moment. You're good and you're good to go on a plane after that, or it may take a few more sessions to kind of slowly ungrip from that habit loop and from that kind of pattern that's kind of been entrenched. You know that you're safe and you're safe and you're safe, and it kind of keeps going. And what I find really interesting is that there's a lot of research. There's evolving research from the cognitive science side of memory reconsolidation.
Yeah,
So Dr. Bruce Eckert, he I think wrote he I think he's kind of big into the coherence therapy frame.
yeah, he wrote the
Um,
original coherence therapy papers, I think.
Nice. Yeah. So coherence therapy is very much in this. And he has this book called Unlocking the Emotional Brain. There's this presentation on YouTube where he talks about how coherence therapy, EMDR, focusing, Gestalt, IFS, Hakomi, somatic experiencing, they all are therapies that work. And they all use this kind of similar general frame. And it's because of this three-step process that, simplifying it, is in the memory reconsolidation frame, where you activate the target experience that may have had its roots. You guide a contradictory experience and you kind of move it towards this contradictory experience, which is generally wholeness and love and embracement. Then you repeat it. And this is often where I think a lot of people ask, okay, is this all just kind of introspecty, like you sit in a room and you solve your problems? No, it actually helps you go back into life and go back into these environments and opens you up towards more freedom. You have more choice and more possibility to do more things, because you're not constrained by these certain behaviors. I was talking to a friend recently about John Vervaeke's Waking Up to the Meaning Crisis series, and I think around like episode 14 or 15, he talks about anxiety in a similar way. So even he, a cognitive scientist from University of Toronto, has his own language for this kind of thing, but it's like opening up the state space of possibilities,
Oh
of
yeah,
like what you can do. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's just like hard to, and you mentioned it too, right? There's within the realm of mental health and psychotherapy, there's kind of a trend towards like evidence backed and things like that, which I think is great, and quite helpful. But and I think there is evolving research to make memory consolidation and these kind of things more evidence backed by papers and stuff. But fundamentally, this is a thing that you can experience and just notice to see if it changes your behaviors in life, and if it allows old patterns to kind of be loved and kind of dissolve on their own, um, and just notice.
yeah, yeah. And I think another cool thing about what IFS enables is, uh, or generally parts work, that these contradictory experiences that can help you let go of that emotional learning, you can have those. You can basically create those contradictory experiences yourself, in your mind. For example, when you in IFS, there's this whole step of when you meet a burdened part, that is like a childhood part who maybe felt neglected. You can basically parent that part and receive that experience of being parented, like of receiving that loving attention. And so even though like there might not be any contradictory experiences out there, you're able to tap into the experiences of love that you have received, and then use those experiences to create this feeling of love, and then give that to the parts of you that felt neglected or like, um, burdened in any other way, and then feel in real time how receiving that, uh, quote unquote contradictory experience is helping you let go of that old emotional learning. And so in that sense, it's also quite empowering that, you don't necessarily need to, yeah, receive like, or like depend on some external source to solve your problems, although that is very much valuable. But that you can, take what you already have, your innate resources, and then channel them towards the parts of you that need that, and in that process move towards
Yeah.
wholeness and freedom.
And what's interesting too, I think, yeah, fully agree with everything you said. And it's interesting because there's a sense that it's an innate, you can tap into your innate resource And there's also a sense, paradoxically, that it's not yours, that it's just kind of there, and in some sense requires a surrendering or an opening up, or just like a dropping and a leaving. And this is
Yeah.
where kind of, and it can, and it, the flavor of that depends on the person, of if that feels innate or external. But there's just this thing of like, there is this resource, and there is just this, you can unfold into this kind of present way of being that just like brings these kind of qualities to it. And going back to kind of what you said before, I think this is where a lot of these like moves and stuff can be stacked. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And so adding one more thing which might be relevant for later in the conversation but feels relevant here is, so one of the ways to get the most out of your parts work experience is becoming sensitive to what innate resources you already have that are unique to you. For example, for someone, curiosity or wonder might come much more naturally than things like compassion or
Mhm.
open-heartedness. And the idea is that you can take what is already natural to you, what is already good, like what you're already good at, and everyone has something, right? And bring those qualities into your parts work exploration, and it will be much more easier for you to lean into it, and you are approaching parts work from a place of strength and empowerment. And so IFS definitely has a way of doing this, which they like label as the self, and they have a bunch of qualities that they ascribe to self. But I feel that can end up being a bit abstract for a lot of people. They don't know what
Mhm.
self feels like for them. And so I think sitting with the question that what are self-like qualities, like, or general openness or open-hearted adjacent qualities that are natural for you, and then when you approach parts work, having that as your guiding energy. And so yeah, some random thoughts in connection.
Yeah. That's great. No, it's interesting because there's a bit of a bootstrapping problem here,
Oh
where
yeah.
like to get started, it's the hardest part. I think like we both have solid meditation practices and have had some pretty powerful psychedelic experiences with like psilocybin and MDMA, and that's all great. But in some ways, those are like power tools that like clearly show you that this stuff helps and works, but is also not probably that like actionable for majority of people, especially if you want to try this out in a day or two. Um, so I actually reviewed some of my old class notes from this mindful self-compassion class. And it's interesting because there's a lot of little things you can do, like almost like giving yourself a hug, like giving yourself warmth, using kind of a weighted blanket, just the general aspect, just general role of contact and physical touch can be nice. I think even some of the love language stuff that's
Oh
kind of
yeah.
mainstream can help, like words of reassurance, or all that kind of stuff. Just like what gives you a more sense of reassurance and reserve and warmth and spaciousness. It doesn't have to be significant. It can always be these little tiny things, but you kind of dial into that, and you start noticing what that feels like. So you can kind of move there when you need to, and you can move there uh, more regularly. And eventually you maybe have a practice every day that you use to kind of move into that state. And then I think in the short run, there are a couple things, and it may not feel that impactful, but in the long run, by doing some of these habits, it becomes a felt sense. You're building a sense of being able to attune to these qualities, and that builds your own inner resource in a way that allows for further self-healing and self-flourishing. So it's this positive feedback loop,
Oh
and it's a
yeah.
really pleasant positive feedback loop. But to get that feedback loop going is what is kind of difficult. And there, I think like someone who's trained in some kind of facilitation can really support.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And so a lot of times people ask me some variation of the question that, okay, what's the end game here, or where do we go from here? Or maybe people have one experience and feel like, okay, what's the next steps from here? And this positive feedback loop is what I talk about. And I think this also relates to the idea of self-trust, where the more you show up for your parts in this loving, open, compassionate way, and the more they lower their regards to them, the more you're able to help them. And access hard to reach places of your mind and unburden the pain. And so the parts see that you have the capacity to help them and start trusting you more. And then this new self-trust then gives you more resources to go even more deeper and help even more parts, and creates this virtuous loop which goes on and on and on. And to the point, if one of the end game that uh, would be this deep self-trust where the protector parts, the defensive parts of you, let go and trust your innate wisdom or intelligence or whatever you want to label it as. And so that life in general feels more free and spacious. Again, those qualities that you referred to earlier. And I think it's very easy to get a felt sense of this virtuous loop in like, it, let's say, even just 10 hours of doing these explorations. And so I think it's quite an asymmetric bet to just try investing 10 hours or 20 hours into these
Yeah.
explorations and see what it's like for
Yeah. It can be incredibly worth it. My friend Daniel Kazanjian, he has this pinned tweet. Self discipline is actually self domination, and I think that's somewhat related. But gets into this thing of, you know, I think we all live our life in some sense of not actually believing ourselves, or in some sense of like not trusting ourselves, and it's kind of built into the language. Like,
yeah
don't use motivation, use discipline. Don't, you know, there's this kind of general thing of like pushing and you have to, and I think that's all fine and it can work to a certain extent. But you know, once you in this tweet he says, if you privilege one of your internal stakeholders at the expense of all others, inevitably your psyche generates a coup, and the parts you bullied vie for power and disrupt your life.
yeah
And I think we kind of see this in people's stories of where they have like, you know, like maybe like founder stories or burnout stories, or in general, you can push yourself. But if you're not fully bought in, you constantly can get a lot of just like backlash, and just kind of this like fighting yourself, and the internal forcing. A lot of people are really good at it, but then it like doesn't actually help in the long run, because I know a lot of people who then burn out and need a couple years to recover, or just like are totally out of touch with themselves. Um, but this slow kind of, and it's like you have these this scaffolding, this kind of like scaffolding to hold up these, I think it's called like load bearing
yeah
parts of your psyche, you know. um but then, you know, and this is both the difficult part of like why it totally makes sense to not want to get into this, but also how it's so helpful. Your psyche and your motivation structures might be this kind of house of cards, where this kind of like, house of cards is a little too strong of a phrase, but it's kind of like, it's just not made with stuff that you want to actually have there for 10-20 years. um and I think that's why culturally we see this thing like the midlife crisis, you know, kind of like just general existential crises. And by rebuilding into a much stronger foundation, where everything's kind of going in a similar direction, you actually become more resilient and robust to crises, in a way that you end up becoming like anti-fragile to them, where crises actually are fuel towards greater self-trust. And like moving in towards that, it just feels like a really powerful way of living, especially in a time, like societally, that has so much disruption and change, and everything. It kind of just builds this inner, like from resilience to robustness to anti-fragility. Like it's actually, they're not all the same, and it becomes like a timeline of where you move.
yeah yeah and your words reminded me of this beautiful quote which goes something like, in a war with yourself you will always lose. And
Mm,
that's such a profound quote for me that yeah, again ties back to what you were saying, that if you fight against yourself, like some part of you is losing, and um, sooner or later, like you will have to, yeah, quote unquote, pay your debts.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah,
uh, um, yeah, I think let's move into the technicalities of the things maybe. And
yeah.
I think one good place to start would be, how does one get started? And so, what was your starting experience like about IFS?
Yeah.
What got you hooked onto it? And yeah, if someone was looking to start out today, or even like have had a couple of experiences and looking to get more out of it, what would be your recommendations?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there are a lot of paths to enter. For me, it was through meditation and through kind of noticing things and then having this general stance of like, oh, okay, compassion's probably good and all that. And I think that's actually like not common for most people, but we'll stick to that path for now. So if you're kind of a meditator and you want to be kind of go deeper into meditation, and if you want some sense of, especially if you follow meditation as it has kind of derived from Buddhist paths, especially in early Buddhism, there can be this conception of like awakening or kind of these stages of enlightenment, which is great. And I think in a lot of ways, this type of work is extremely complementary to that in a way that later Buddhism, such as in Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism, has found extremely helpful. So, without going into the weeds, that I think is a path of kind of from meditation into this kind of parts work towards greater meditation and wholeness that supports the expansion of qualities you want to cultivate. That's great. I think most commonly though is kind of this I am in pain and I need help. And often, people are in crisis when they enter the kind of introspective therapeutic work. Um, and there, I think so. There's kind of a few different ways of looking at it. Like in crisis, it can be quite difficult to like really get in the groove of things and do it as fully as possible, and that's totally fine. Like I think in crisis, the thing to do is to kind of find a bit of relief in that moment, and then once there's kind of a general sense of safety, um, then you can kind of go in and like refactor some of the things using this parts work approach where yeah, so that's another thing from the actual tactical. I find that yeah, at least so especially in the US and in the West, um there are like a lot of therapist directories and ways to kind of find IFS therapists through that. What's really interesting though is that I find that a lot of my friends who have had IFS therapists, I think they can be quite good, but I've actually like referred them to you often, and like you found that like, oh my god, Theo is a lot better, and I get a lot more in a single session than my own therapist. And it not to fault the therapist, I think they're probably great, they're trained and everything, but the way that therapy is often done is through these. It has kind of this view that you have to like really build strong rapport, and that takes a lot of time, and it still kind of moves back towards a talk therapy approach because there's kind of the sense that people aren't necessarily ready for somatic work or don't have the capacity for it. Um, and I find that kind of just going into it, you'll meet yourself where you're at, and you only go as deep as you can go, which I think is pretty fascinating. Um, yeah, so not a great answer, but that's kind of what's come to mind there. Just lots of ways to enter, and I think like you can, I think the main phase in the first part is just moving towards a shift. Like you want to be able to experience it somatically. And I think listening to people doing IFS, like from the Tim Ferriss, Richard Schwartz podcast, can like show you that it's there. Uh, Doing guided meditations. So Locke Kelly has quite a few that combines his way of meditation with this kind of stuff. Um, Doing somatic types of uh, meditation practice, like feeling your feet and everything, going up from there, even yoga, but really just kind of this, just getting a better sense of the body and noticing that shifts can happen with emotions. And then from there, you can find practitioners, read books, work with people, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that answer. And yeah, before I give my answer, I definitely want to like emphasize on the somatic aspect of it, because that's like I would definitely say it's prerequisite to some degree. Although I wouldn't like say that you need to have a high degree of somatic awareness. Maybe what IFS will help you is like get that high degree of connection with your body. And but yeah, I think having a felt experience is what distinguishes parts work from some of the other modalities like CBT or other analysis focused modalities. And I think a very easy way to have a felt experience is an easy way of meeting one of your parts is finding some example from your recent past where something made you angry. The anger is an emotion that I think all of us feel in different ways, and it's easy to relatively find something that makes you angry. And so, see if we can tap into that emotion of anger, allow that to come up in your body, and start with, of course, noticing what it's like to be angry in your body. Where do you notice some sensations or some movement of energy, and then allowing it, and then, yeah, bringing in this frame of seeing it as a part of you that is angry, and then inviting the part to express themselves, and maybe also like bringing in this prompt of, okay, if this angry part was a person or a being, what would they look like or be like? What would their body language be like? What would their demeanor be like, or facial expressions? And so slowly pay more attention to your experience and use that to fill in more details of the parts. And even if you're not a visual person, certain visual associations will come up for you. And and then, yeah, you have this part in front of you, and then you can, yeah, start playfully interacting with this part. um, Start asking any questions that you feel like asking to the part. You can maybe start with a simple question like, okay, what do you want for me by bringing up this anger? And just be curious about that part. So I think this is a very simple way to get a glimpse of your parts and have an interaction with your parts. And from there, uh, once you have this available, you can now, uh, you will naturally be more curious about the literature around this. And so you can read more stuff and like find more moves to do and play around more. And I think what some of the bottlenecks or limitations that you might hit is, so one, like sustaining focus is a bottleneck for a lot of us, and this is where like having someone hold space for you can be really useful. This can be a facilitator, but this can also be just a friend. And if you can like get a friend of yours also interested in this and like hold space for each other, so that will help you sustain focus and also help you keep track, because it's very easy to get lost or sidetracked. Like you're with one part and then some other thoughts come in and then you're off a tangent. And so that's what stops us from going deep. So having someone hold space for you, and this someone can also be an chatbot. And I think we're going to see a lot of cool products in this space very soon. And but yeah, having that interaction and glimpse, and uh, then eventually having an experience with a facilitator who will be able to help you see through your blind spots. If there's something fundamental that's blocking you from interacting with your parts, which happens for a lot of people, right? They're either not able to connect with their body, or they just get distracted super quickly, or it's all just blank for them. um, Someone can help you like become sensitive to these blind spots. And then there's of course this very useful frame that all blind spots, all difficulties, all resistance is just another part trying to protect you or help you or get your attention to something that is important. And uh, being able to do that, and and then I think what's super valuable, which has helped me a lot, which has basically helped me deliver good experiences for people, is doing sessions that go for like 90 minutes to 2 hours.
Mhm.
Like if you sustain focus and bring a sense of direction for that long, it will help you go really deep and have experiences that are really powerful. And so if you can find a way to do that, that's and then it's also like good enough timeline to good enough space to move through certain resistances and then actually go deep. So having that experience for me also, like my first IFS experience when it was Matt Goldenberg who guided me, having that experiences and interacting with a bunch of parts, having resolutions with those parts is what got me instantly hooked on to IFS. I could see those changes in real time. And
Yeah.
these are some of my off the top of head thoughts about how one should get started if they're new
Yeah,
to
and
it.
it's interesting because I think what's interesting is I think we both come from a frame that's very pro autodidactism and pro kind of figure it out yourself and kind of a bit rebellious in a sense, like
Yeah,
not necessarily needing it to be like through a certain structure or system or certification. Because I think all those things cost a lot of money and aren't very accessible. And like to say that the only way to do this is through like a certified Western therapist is a bit limiting, you know?
yeah,
And honestly, just like not correct, I think, fundamentally. And you're in India, Theo, and I learned about all this through the pandemic, where I in a time where I didn't have a job, so it was hard for me to like I couldn't afford to like do stuff like that in a way that is typically advocated, essentially. Uh, and I think that it's like, especially thinking of the globe and the fact that through kind of our little corner on Twitter, we've met people from across the world that are into this stuff, and yeah, I think the like you said with chatbots and with all the books out there, there's so many ways, and a guided audio content, so many ways to kind of experience this yourself, and um and finding a facilitator or even like finding a peer or like group of people to practice with can be extremely powerful because the community aspect and just like the relational aspect, both intra-relational within your parts and interrelational between other people, is huge. Um, and that can allow you to go way deeper. I remember when I was doing it myself for a while, it was great. But when I had my first session with you, um, I was able to go to a level that was far deeper and far more thorough, and notice this like branching network of parts where like I couldn't necessarily go underneath one because another block was there, and then kind of this like layer of multiple blocks and multiple depths. And each of those lines could be resolved back to this main thing, and there's this whole ecosystem and general set of constellations. And by doing that with you, I find myself to be a little bit better at doing that myself, but it's still really helpful to work with people. But it's not a one or the other. It's synergistic.
yeah,
Because kind of we touched on this a bit, but I think to like really hit home, this is a thing that does not have to stay like in the session. And on meditators talk about it as like on the cushion practice. Like on the cushion IFS is working with someone in these kind of dedicated sessions, and that's great. But eventually, the off the cushion or kind of like daily life part becomes just as important, if not more. Um, and you notice all the little ways that you contract and these you get blended with your parts in a way that takes you away from your grounded self nature, and yeah, it just goes quite deep and thorough into all of life if you want it to be.
definitely. And one other thing that came to mind while you were talking was, I think a good intro to IFS is also focusing. And so I think, yeah, Mark Lipman calls IFS as basically like a structured supercharger for focusing. And I think that that's really interesting uh, because, like, so first talking about focusing, which is relatively much more simple than IFS, and it teaches a core skill about attending to what's happening in your body, get it into your awareness with more clarity, and then find a handle on it. So this is like I see this as the core skill of what we are doing in basically all of parts work. And so if you are able to get a feeling for this skill and maybe even do a few experimentations again with yourself or with someone else, and uh, get a feeling for this. Okay, getting a clear felt sense on something that's going on in your experience in your body and finding a handle on it. And then what in IPS, what we're doing is basically we're using the power of imagination and narrativization to supercharge the process of finding a handle. And
Mm-hmm.
because it's relational in nature, it just happens in a superfluous way. But when you're able to find those handles, it will automatically lead to shifts. And if you can start with a feeling and then even experience one small shift, that that skill translates really well into IFS. And so focusing is another of my go-to recommendations to people who are new to parts work, even people who have done parts work quite a bit. Like I focused on focusing quite later in my journey, and
Yep.
retrospectively found a lot of value in it, because that core skill, because it's the fundamentals, right? And if you uh, practice the fundamentals, your game just inevitably gets better. So yeah, this focusing, I highly recommend. Then the next natural step is IFS, and then eventually you will uh, find yourself looking for more moves or inventing your own moves. One way of how I think about IFS or parts work is, so I think IFS is super useful, has some really useful framing and steps to uh, connect with the protector parts and eventually help you like convince them to let go of their defenses and get to this painful feeling that you did not want to feel. But I think once you get here, you can be super creative in how you move through that feeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is where you can bring in so many other modalities that you might have experienced in other contexts of your self-exploration journey. For example, you can bring in the ideal parent figure protocol, which IFS in a way already does, or you can bring in somatic experiencing, where you're just focusing on the raw sensation of the painful feeling and
Mm-hmm.
deeply welcoming it. Or yeah, you can bring in ideas from coherence therapy or memory reconsolidation and uh, processing that pain by juxtaposing it with contradictory experiences. And or you can, I don't know, even bring in self-touch or massages, or bring in another human who will help you move through that pain. So uh, yeah, again, I don't know where I was
Yeah.
going, some random thoughts.
No, that's great. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I also agree that focusing is kind of the first step, and IFS was next. But what's fascinating is you kind of touched on this too. It also could be the reverse. Some people start with just the narrative view of parts in IFS, and it's mostly cognitive. Then maybe you get into like your values and other like somewhat sense of shifts, but it's not very somatic. And then later you do focusing. And I've been recently kind of attuned to this, aware of this program called Altheia coaching by this guy Steve March, who similarly has I think there's a lot of people wanting to integrate all these practices into one system, and Altheia is one such way of doing that, where it talks about first doing parts work and then process work, and process being focusing and other things like it, and then a few more. But it's wild because I think once you kind of get into any of these, you can start seeing how they fit together in a way that's very cohesive. And yeah, if you already have, you kind of just work with what you like. For me, I never really, I have most like largely aphantasia, so it's hard to visualize things very well. But I have a pretty solid somatic sensory clarity, and going into that is quite helpful. So yeah, lots of ways to slice it and then to enter into it. But once you do, it just stuff starts opening up and the dominoes start falling. In a lot of ways for the better.
Yeah, I think that bit about aphantasia is really interesting and important, because yeah, this is where a lot of people face challenges, right? Because everyone has a very unique uh, phenomenology. Everyone's inner experience is so unique. For some people, they don't see any visuals at all. For some people, like it's hyper aphantasia, like it's widely uh, animated. And for some people, their interaction with parts are quite verbal, and for some people, it's very non-verbal. And then, of course, like you mentioned, we all fall somewhere on the spectrum of sensory clarity or somatic awareness. And so I think one, being aware that you will have a way of interacting with your parts which will be unique to you. And if what is in the traditional literature doesn't seem to be working for you, then it doesn't mean that you can't do parts work. It's just that you might have to tune into what are your moves. And uh, I also feel that you can interact with your parts in ways that uh, are very unconventional. For example, there's no reason why you cannot communicate with your parts telepathically or non-verbally, and or for some people it can be just images, right? And if you can't find a verbal handle on the feeling, if you can't get a verbal answer, just getting an image that resonates can create shifts. And just moving through those images, allowing those images to unfold as you just tune into resonance, can be such a trippy experience. And yeah, in general, what I would recommend is if you are experiencing difficulties in connecting with your parts or doing parts work in general, I would recommend doing a lot of experimentation that is out of the box, that is unconventional. And uh, while while adopting the focusing frame of what you're looking for is resonance, basically. Something arises in your experience, and now what you're trying to do is look for resonance through images or words, or even just bodily resonance that will um, feel connected to what's arising, and then allow your intuition to take the lead from there and see
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah. Well said. Cool. I feel like we've covered a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, this feels like a good uh, point to close for the part one. There's so much more that we could talk about, and we'll record another conversation which talks about meditation and parts work.
Yeah.
That will be a favorite topic for both of us. How,
That's the juicy stuff.
yeah, definitely. And then also talking about the limitations of parts work, we focused a lot on what's good about parts work and what makes it so cool. But yeah, definitely some limitations too. And eventually you would want to go beyond parts work, and that's important too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. So let's close. More to come later on.
Yeah, and this was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.